The night Harold Whitmore sold his niece for $200, he did not even look her in the eye. He counted the bills on the kitchen table, slowly, deliberately, while Clara stood in the doorway holding the only bag she owned. She was 18 years old. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the Wyoming wind was tearing itself apart against the walls of the house, and her uncle smoothed each bill flat with his thumb like he was finishing a business transaction at the feed store. "You leave at first light," he said. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I had no choice." Just, "You leave at first light." If you have ever felt completely invisible to someone who was supposed to protect you, then you already know exactly what Clara felt standing in that doorway. And if you haven't, consider yourself fortunate. Don't go anywhere. Stay until the very end of this story, because what happens to Clara Whitmore is something you will not see coming. If this channel is new to you, subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because the stories we tell here don't let go easily. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara had not always lived with Harold Whitmore. There had been a time, not so long ago that she'd forgotten it, but far enough back that it sometimes felt like something she'd dreamed, when she had lived in a house that smelled like biscuits in the morning and where her father hummed while he sharpened his tools. Her mother had kept a small herb garden along the south wall of the kitchen, and Clara had spent half her childhood crouched beside it, learning which leaves were for fever, which were for pain, which were just for smell. Her parents died within 6 months of each other. Her father first, from a chest sickness that came in the fall and never left. Her mother 4 months later, which Clara believed was less about illness and more about a woman who had simply lost the reason to keep getting up in the morning. She was 15 when she went to live with her uncle. Harold Whitmore was her father's older brother, and the resemblance ended at the jaw. Her father had been a patient man, the kind who explained things twice without irritation. Harold was a man who believed that silence was laziness, and that a girl without work was a girl getting into trouble. He had a wife, Margaret, who had mastered the art of moving through a room without making a sound, and 2 grown sons who came around on Sundays to eat and leave without offering to clear the table. From the first week, Clara understood her role in that house. She was not a niece. She was the girl who woke before the sun and had breakfast on the table before Harold's boots hit the floor. She was the one who carried water, scrubbed laundry, patched fences, and shoveled the path to the outhouse in weather cold enough to crack stone. She was given a room that had been used for storage, a mattress that had seen better decades, and a single wool blanket that smelled permanently of mothballs. She was never thanked. She was rarely addressed by name, and if she made a mistake, burned the biscuits, didn't have the water heated fast enough, left a window latch loose, and let in a draft, Harold had a way of looking at her that made her feel like a stray that had wandered in and hadn't yet been driven back out. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was saving money, though Harold paid her nothing, and she had no idea toward what she was saving. She told herself that when spring came, she would figure something out. 3 years passed. Spring came and went 4 times, and Clara was still there. The winter that changed everything arrived early. By October, the snow was already past the fence posts. The cattle were miserable. Harold's mood was worse than the cattle. He had made some bad investments. Clara overheard enough kitchen table arguments with Margaret to piece together that he had lost money on a land deal that had gone sour, and that the feed prices were running him dry. She did not feel sorry for him. She knew she should have. She tried. But when she looked at Harold Whitmore hunched over his accounts at the kitchen table, all she could see was a man who had never once asked her how she was sleeping. It was a Tuesday in late November when he came to find her in the yard where she was breaking ice off the water trough. "Come inside," he said. She followed him. There was a man sitting at the kitchen table she had never seen before. He was somewhere past 40, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something unreadable. He wore a coat that cost more than everything in Harold's house combined, and he held his hat in both hands with the careful stillness of someone who was waiting but not nervous. His name, Harold told her, was Ethan Cole. He owned the largest cattle operation in the next county. Clara looked at the man. The man looked at Clara. Harold did not offer her a chair. "Mr. Cole has need of someone to manage his household," Harold said. "He's got 3 children and nobody to keep things running. His wife passed last year." Clara turned to look at her uncle. What does that have to do with me? Harold picked up the glass of water on the table and took a long drink before answering. He's agreed to take you on. I've already given my word. The words didn't land right away. They came in, rearranged themselves, and then hit. You... She stopped, started again. You arranged this without asking me. You live under my roof. You'll do as you're told. She looked at Ethan Cole. He was watching the exchange with the expression of a man watching a business negotiation, not the conversation of a human being being handed off like a piece of livestock. He wasn't cruel in his face. He wasn't warm either. He was simply waiting. What exactly are the terms? Clara asked. She was looking at Cole now, not her uncle. If she looked at Harold, she was going to do or say something she couldn't take back. Ethan Cole answered without flinching. You'd keep the house. Cook, clean, look after the children. There are 3 of them. Caleb's 12, Rose is 9, and Millie just turned 6. You'd have your own room, food, and a small wage. A wage, she repeated. Monthly. She almost asked what Harold was getting out of the arrangement, but one glance at the folded bills sitting at the edge of the table answered that. Harold had already been paid. She was not being offered a job. She was being sold. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay on her mothball mattress and stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through what she was feeling, which was difficult because she was feeling several things at once, and none of them were particularly useful. There was rage, clean and sharp, at a man who had never seen her as anything other than a resource to be managed. There was fear, the dull, low-grade kind that settles into your chest and makes breathing slightly harder than it should be. There was something else underneath it all, something she didn't examine too closely because she was afraid of what it was. It was relief. Not at being sold, not at being handed to a stranger, but at the idea that she was leaving this house. That the kitchen with its perpetual smell of grease and Harold's pipe tobacco was not going to be the last place she ever lived. That something, even something frightening, was about to change. She lay there until the sky outside the small window began to shift from black to gray, and then she got up, packed her bag, and walked out of the room without looking back at it. Margaret was in the kitchen when she came through. The woman was standing at the stove with her back turned, and for a moment Clara thought she might say something, might reach out and put a hand on her arm, might offer some small acknowledgement of the fact that the girl who had lived in this house for 3 years, who had cooked every meal and hauled every bucket, and never once complained out loud, was walking out the door this morning, not because she chose to, but because her uncle had counted out $200 the night before. Margaret did not turn around. Clara put her hand on the door. Take care, Margaret said to the stove. Clara walked out. Ethan Cole was waiting in his wagon at the edge of the road. He had a dark horse that stood very still in the cold, and the wagon was covered with canvas over the bed. He didn't say good morning. He helped her up to the seat without comment, took up the reins, and they moved. The snow had started before they were a mile out. By the time they had traveled 2 miles, it was something harder to call by that name. It was a wall of white that seemed to be coming from every direction at once, and the horse was putting its head down into it and moving by stubbornness alone. Clara gripped the edge of the seat and told herself not to show that she was frightened. Ethan Cole said nothing for a long time. He drove with his shoulders hunched into the wind and his jaw set, and Clara studied his profile in the way you study someone you're going to be living with, trying to find the edge of the thing before you reach it. How old are you? Old are you? He finally said. 18. He made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement. My children will test you, he said. Most children do. Mine more than most. He said it flatly, without pride or apology. Their mother died 11 months ago. They've run off 2 housekeepers since then. What happened to them? One quit. One I sent away. What was wrong with them? He was quiet for a moment. They thought the children needed discipline. What they needed was someone who wasn't afraid of them. Clara thought about that. Are you afraid of them? It was a strange thing to ask a man she'd known for less than a day. She felt him stiffen slightly before he answered. I'm afraid of failing them. It was the most human thing he'd said. It caught her off guard. She turned back to look at the road ahead, which was mostly not visible anymore, and thought about a man who could say a thing like that with so little performance attached to it. I'm not going to run, she said. I haven't given you a reason to stay yet. No, she agreed. You haven't. The snow intensified. The horse slowed. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the white, was a ranch she had never seen, and 3 children she had never met, and a life that had been decided for her by a man counting bills on a kitchen table. Clara pulled her coat tighter and kept her eyes forward. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, wood smoke cutting through the cold, and then the shapes of buildings emerged from the white like suggestions. A large house, dark wood, windows lit from inside, a barn to the left, fencing that disappeared into the storm on both sides. It was a working place, not a beautiful one, and something about that was actually a comfort. Ethan pulled the wagon up close to the porch and climbed down without ceremony. Clara was already climbing down on her side before he came around, and she saw something flicker across his face when he realized she hadn't waited for help. She couldn't tell if it irritated him or not. She stood in the snow with her bag and looked at the house. The front door opened. 3 children stood in the doorway. The oldest, a boy, had his arms crossed and was looking at her with the particular expression of a 12-year-old boy who has decided in advance that he is not going to like something. The middle one, a girl, was half hidden behind the doorframe. The youngest was standing at the very front, a small girl with dark hair and enormous eyes, and she was looking at Clara with an expression that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. It was the look of someone who has been disappointed so many times that they've stopped letting themselves feel the before part. "This is Miss Whitmore," Ethan said to the 3 of them. "She'll be managing the house." The boy, Caleb, looked Clara up and down. "She's younger than Mrs. Patterson was." "That's an observation, not a greeting," Ethan said. Caleb said nothing. He uncrossed his arms, turned, and walked back inside. Rose slid fully behind the door frame so that only one eye was visible. Little Millie kept looking at Clara with those enormous dark eyes. Then she said very quietly, "Did you come from far away?" "Far enough," Clara said. "Are you going to let me in out of the cold?" Millie stepped back from the doorway. It wasn't quite a welcome, but it wasn't a door in the face either. Clara picked up her bag and walked into the coal house. The inside of the house told her everything she needed to know and nothing she wanted to hear. It was not dirty. It was not falling apart. It was a house being maintained by the bare minimum of effort. Dishes clean but stacked wrong, floors swept but not scrubbed, surfaces clear but coated in the particular dullness of a space that nobody loved anymore. There was a portrait on the wall of a woman with light hair and a direct gaze, and Clara recognized, without being told, that this was the woman whose absence was in every corner of this room. She set her bag down in the hallway. Ethan was already moving toward the back of the house, shrugging off his coat. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left. Kitchen starts at 5. Children eat before 7. What do they eat for breakfast?" He paused. "Whatever you can make." "Do you have preferences?" "I eat what's put in front of me." "That's not what I asked." He stopped, turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he said, "Caleb doesn't eat eggs. They make him sick. Rose has a bad tooth on the left side, so nothing too hard. Millie won't eat anything gray." He said it like he was reading from a list he'd memorized under duress. Clara filed each thing away. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and walked away. She stood in the hallway of the coal house, listening to the storm push against the walls, listening to the footsteps of 3 children somewhere above her head, and felt the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here settled down onto her shoulders. She had been sold. She was standing in a stranger's house, and she had absolutely nothing except the stubbornness that had gotten her through 3 years of Harold Whitmore's silence and the knowledge her mother had pressed into her hands before she died. She looked at the portrait of the woman on the wall for a long moment. "I'm not trying to be you," she said quietly. "To no one. To everyone. I'm just trying to get through the winter." Then she picked up her bag and climbed the stairs. The room Ethan Cole had given her was small and cold and smelled like cedar and disuse, and Clara spent her first night in it staring at a ceiling she couldn't see in the dark, listening to the storm work itself into a fury against the walls of the house. The bed was real, at least. A proper frame, a mattress that didn't sag in the middle, 2 quilts folded at the foot. After 3 years on Harold Whitmore's hand-me-down mattress, it felt almost indulgent, which told her something about how low her standards had been allowed to fall. She didn't sleep much. She lay there and took inventory instead. She knew 3 things about the children. Caleb couldn't eat eggs, Rose had a bad tooth, and Millie wouldn't eat anything gray. She knew one thing about Ethan Cole. He was afraid of failing his children, and he had said so out loud to a stranger in the middle of a blizzard, which meant either he didn't guard himself well or he had simply stopped caring who knew it. She knew one thing about this house. It was being held together by obligation and not much else, and obligation, in her experience, had a shelf life. She also knew one thing about herself, which was that she had walked into Harold Whitmore's house at 15 with nothing and had survived it by learning the shape of every room before she needed it in the dark. She would do the same thing here. At 4:30 she got up, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs to find the kitchen. It took her 20 minutes to understand the stove. It was older than she expected and ran hotter on the left side, and another 10 to locate where things were kept, which required opening nearly every cabinet twice because nothing was organized by logic. Someone had been maintaining this kitchen by memory alone, going to the same spots out of habit rather than sense. She found flour behind the salt, found the good skillet hanging in the wrong place, found a cast iron pot with a cracked handle that someone had kept anyway, wedged in the back corner like a problem that hadn't been dealt with. She made biscuits from scratch, which she could do half asleep. She found dried sausage and sliced it thin. She found eggs and set them aside for herself and Ethan, since Caleb couldn't eat them. She found oats and started a pot of porridge, adding dried apples she found in a cloth sack at the back of the pantry, because gray porridge was apparently off the table for Millie, and dried apple would change both the color and the flavor enough to solve that problem without making a production of it. She had everything on the table by 6:40. Millie came down first. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in a nightgown that was slightly too big for her dark hair loose and tangled, and she stopped when she saw Clara already there and already finished. "You're awake," Millie said. "I am." "Mrs. Patterson didn't get up until 7. "I'm not Mrs. Patterson." Millie came closer to the table and looked at the bowl of porridge set at the smallest chair. She studied it. "It's orange. The apple turned it." "Is that all right?" Millie sat down and picked up her spoon without another word, which Clara took as a yes. Rose came next, moving carefully down the stairs in a way that suggested she'd learned to make herself small in this house. She had her mother's coloring, light hair, light eyes, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the table, and then at Clara, and then back at the table with the specific caution of a child who had been burned before by trusting something new. "Sit down," Clara said. "It's hot." Rose sat. Caleb came down last, still fully dressed, which meant he'd either slept in his clothes or been up for a while. He looked at the table and then at Clara and said, "Are those eggs?" "Yours is the porridge. The eggs are for your father." Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who had been bracing for a fight and found the door already open. He sat down without another word. Ethan came in at 7:05. He stopped in the kitchen doorway for a single moment, taking in the table, 3 children eating, steam still rising, nothing burned, and then he sat down and ate without comment. Clara stood at the stove and ate her own biscuits standing up because there were only 4 chairs, and she wasn't going to make an issue of it on day 1. She watched the children eat and logged everything. Caleb ate fast and didn't talk. Rose ate slowly and kept her left hand near her jaw without touching it, protecting the bad tooth by instinct. Millie ate the porridge down to the bottom of the bowl and then looked up at Clara with something in her face that hadn't been there the night before. "It was good," Millie said. "I'm glad," Clara said. Ethan looked up briefly from his plate. He looked at Clara and then at Millie and then back at his plate, and he said nothing, but she noticed it. That was the first morning. The first week was harder. She learned the ranch the way she had learned Harold's house, by being put to work in it before she fully understood it, which meant making mistakes that cost her time and effort, but taught her things no explanation would have covered. The water situation was more complicated than she'd realized. The main well had a temperamental pump that required a specific sequence: prime, wait, pump twice slow, then fast. And nobody had told her because nobody thought to tell her. She learned it by failing it twice in the cold, and then standing there in the yard afterward, hands numb, trying to think through the problem logically instead of giving up and going inside. She also learned that the ranch hands had their own rhythm that had nothing to do with the household, that Ethan came in for meals and went back out and rarely came in between, that the barn cat had claimed the kitchen step as its personal territory and would absolutely scratch you if you startled it, and that Rose had a habit of leaving her shoes in whatever room she'd last taken them off, so that locating them in the morning required a small expedition. She did not try to fix everything at once. That was a mistake she'd seen other people make, coming into a broken system and announcing all the things wrong with it before they'd earned the right to say so. Instead, she fixed things quietly, reorganized the kitchen over 3 days, one section at a time, so that by the end of it, everything was where it should be, and she hadn't had to explain herself to anyone. Moved the good skillet to the right hook, found a piece of wire to stabilize the cracked pot handle so it could be used safely again. The children watched her. She could feel it, the way children observe things when they're trying to decide whether a person is going to last. Caleb was the hardest read. He wasn't openly hostile, which she had expected. He was something worse, performatively indifferent. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words required and then removed himself from whatever space she was in. She had seen that pattern before, and she recognized it for what it was. Not dislike, but protection. If you don't care about something, it can't leave you. She didn't push. She made his porridge in the morning, and she said good morning when he came in, and she asked him once, in the second week, if he could show her where the spare fence wire was kept, because she'd noticed a section along the east pen that was starting to go, and she thought it ought to be dealt with before the temperature dropped further. He looked at her for a moment with that 12-year-old calculation running behind his eyes. Then he said, "It's in the barn, back left corner, on the floor." "Thank you," she said. "Pa usually handles the fences." "I know. I'm asking so I know where it is, not so I can fix it tonight." He studied her for another moment. Then he went back to what he'd been doing. That was the most they'd spoken in 2 weeks. It was progress. The whispers from town started on her third Sunday. She'd driven the wagon in with Ethan to get supplies, sitting beside him in the cold with a list she'd written out the night before. She was not naive about what she looked like. A young woman arriving on a ranch through a private arrangement, no wedding, no announcement, just suddenly there. She knew how that read. She had known it since that first morning. What she hadn't anticipated was how openly people would discuss it in front of her. She was standing at the dry goods counter waiting while the man behind it filled the order when she heard 2 women behind her, speaking at a volume calibrated to be heard without being technically directed at her. "That's her, the one Cole brought in for the house." "She looks young." "She is young. Someone sold her to him from what I heard. Family couldn't keep her." Clara kept her eyes on the counter. Her jaw tightened. She breathed out slow. "Poor children," the second woman said. "Having a stranger in the house like that." Clara took the wrapped parcel the man passed across the counter, said thank you in a normal voice, and walked out of the store. She stood beside the wagon in the cold and waited for Ethan, and when he came out and climbed up beside her and took up the reins, she didn't say a word about what she'd heard. He said nothing either. They were a mile out of town before he spoke. "I know what they say. I don't need to hear it repeated." "No," he agreed. "You don't." The horse moved through the snow and the silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but waited. Clara looked at the white fields going past and thought about what it meant to be talked about in a place where you'd chosen nothing. "I won't apologize for the arrangement," Ethan said. His voice was flat, not hard. "I needed someone. My children needed someone. But I know what it cost you." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the road. "Do you?" He was quiet. Then, "No, probably not." It was the most honest thing a man had said to her in longer than she could easily remember. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure it warranted thanks. But she looked at his profile and revised 1 or 2 of her early assumptions about Ethan Cole. It was Rose who gave Clara the letters. It was a Thursday afternoon in early January, when the snow had let up for a few days, and a pale, thin light was making a weak attempt at getting through the kitchen window. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table going through the household accounts. Ethan had handed her a ledger on her second week with an expression that suggested this was not something he enjoyed doing and was very willing to hand off. When Rose appeared in the doorway, she stood there for a moment without speaking, which was very like Rose. "There's something," Rose said finally, "in my mother's things." Clara set down the ledger. "Okay. I don't know if Pa knows about them. He didn't go through everything." Rose pressed her lips together. She was 9 years old and carrying something too heavy for it. She used to write things down, notes about us, what we liked, what we were scared of, things like that. Clara waited. "I thought maybe you should see them," Rose said, "since you're trying to take care of us and you don't know us yet." The offer hit Clara somewhere behind the sternum. She had been managing this family by observation alone, learning each child the way you learn a landscape, slowly, by making your way through it. And here was this 9-year-old girl standing in a doorway and offering her a map. "I'd be grateful," Clara said carefully, "if you want to show me." Rose went upstairs and came back with a small wooden box, the kind that had been made to hold letters. She set it on the table in front of Clara and then sat down across from her, not leaving, watching. Clara opened the box. The notes inside were written in a neat, slightly slanted hand on whatever paper had been available. Some on proper stationery, some on the backs of envelopes, one on a piece of brown wrapping paper. They were dated, spanning several years, and they were the most ordinary and heartbreaking things she had ever read. "Caleb is afraid of being left behind. He doesn't say so, but you can see it when he goes quiet at the wrong moment. Rose picks up other people's feelings before they know they're feeling them. She needs someone to check on her, not just assume she's fine. Millie doesn't like sleeping alone when it storms. She will never ask. You have to notice." Clara read through them slowly, Rose watching from across the table, and she felt the particular weight of a woman she had never met handing her something essential from the other side of an absence. When she got to the last one, dated 8 months before Ethan's wife had died, as though she had known something was coming, she closed the box and sat with it for a moment. "Thank you," she said to Rose. This was a gift." Rose looked at the box. "She'd want someone to use them." "I think so too." Rose got up to leave. At the doorway she stopped. "She would have liked you," she said. "Probably." Then she was gone, back up the stairs, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the box under her hands, and the accounts open in front of her, and the afternoon light going thin through the window. She did not cry. She considered it and decided against it. She opened the ledger back up and went back to work. The change was not dramatic. That was the thing. Nobody would have written about it if they'd been watching, because it looked from the outside like almost nothing. It was Caleb setting his plate in the basin without being reminded on a Thursday in February. It was Rose coming to sit at the kitchen table while Clara was cooking, not helping, just being there, and eventually starting to talk about a girl at school she didn't get along with, and Clara listening without offering a solution until Rose arrived at one herself. It was Millie appearing at Clara's bedroom door one night during a windstorm, saying nothing, and Clara simply pulling back the quilt on the other side of the bed, and Millie climbing in without a word spoken on either side. She didn't write those things down. She didn't need to. They were landing somewhere inside her that she had thought was pretty well closed off. The harder thing was Ethan. She understood the children because she had been given a key to them. Ethan was a different problem. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, which meant he also wasn't a man who said many things at all. He moved through his own house like someone who had a specific route mapped out and varied from it as little as possible. He came to meals, he ate, he answered direct questions with direct answers, and he went back out. But she noticed things. She noticed that he came in from the barn one evening when Millie was already asleep at the kitchen table waiting for supper, and instead of waking her, he sat down across the table from Clara and waited, and they ate supper in near silence while Millie slept in her chair. And when it was done, Ethan picked Millie up, very carefully, like she was something that could break, and carried her upstairs. She noticed that he read at night. She had seen the light under his door on the night she was up late, and she had seen him the one time the door was slightly open, sitting in a chair, book open, a glass of something on the table beside him, looking for all the world like a man who had gone somewhere he needed to go and didn't want company for the trip. She noticed that he never talked about his wife. Not once in the week she'd been there had he said her name in conversation. There were photographs in the front room. There was the portrait in the hall. But he moved past both of them like a man choosing a different road because the original one had collapsed. She didn't push that either. Some things you don't push. The problem arrived in the middle of February, and it came from the direction Clara had been half expecting. She was in the dry goods store in town again, this time alone with the wagon, because Ethan had been needed on the east pasture, and she was working through her list at the counter when she heard the door open behind her and felt the specific shift in atmosphere that meant somebody important had walked in. She turned. He was a large man, well-dressed for the frontier, the kind of well-dressed that wanted you to notice it. His name, she would learn later, was Douglas Hart. and he owned the second-largest cattle operation in the territory and had spent several years apparently trying to make it the largest. He knew Ethan. He knew Ethan well enough to have opinions about him, which he was evidently comfortable sharing. He looked at Clara the way you look at something unexpected in a familiar space. "You're the Cole girl," he said. She didn't like the phrasing. "I work for the Cole household." "That what they're calling it?" He said it without the inflection of a question. The man behind the counter had gone very still. Two other customers near the back of the store had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when they're listening without appearing to listen. Clara turned back to the counter. "I'm not interested in discussing the terms of my employment with strangers." "I'm no stranger," Hart said. "I know Ethan Cole better than most." "Then you can discuss it with him." She felt him shift his weight. He was deciding something. She kept her eyes on the list in her hand and waited. "You seem like a smart girl," he said finally. "So I'll say this plainly. This isn't the kind of arrangement that works out well for the woman in it. I've seen it before. You ought to think about what happens to you when it's done." Clara folded the list carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. She looked at the man behind the counter and said, "I'll be back for the rest on Thursday." And then she walked past Douglas Hart and out of the store. She walked to the wagon, took up the reins, and drove. She drove for a full quarter-mile before she let herself feel any of it. The hot flush of anger, the cold edge of something that was almost fear, and underneath both of them, something harder and quieter. Because Douglas Hart was not entirely wrong. She had been thinking about it herself, in the small hours when she couldn't sleep. What was she exactly? She had been sold here. She worked here. She had begun, and this was the part she didn't like looking at directly, she had begun to love these children in the particular helpless way that happened when you stopped protecting yourself from them. Millie climbing into her bed during storms. Rose's careful offers of trust. Caleb's slow, grudging acknowledgement that she existed and was probably not going to disappear. She had no legal standing here. No formal agreement. Nothing that said if this arrangement ended, she had any claim on any of it. On the wage she'd been promised. On the room. On the children who were beginning to be, without her permission, something that mattered to her. She drove back to the ranch in the flat white afternoon light and unhitched the horse and put the wagon away and went inside and started supper, because that was what you did. You kept moving. That evening, Ethan came in from the east pasture later than usual and sat down at the table and ate the stew she'd made in silence. And when the children had gone upstairs and the kitchen was quiet, he pushed his bowl back and said, without looking up, "You ran into Hart in town." It wasn't a question. Someone had told him, or he had a way of knowing things in the particular manner of a man who owned enough land that people kept him informed. "I did," she said. "What did he say?" She considered lying by omission. Then she said, "He implied I was in a bad position and didn't have the sense to know it." Ethan looked up then. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was difficult to read, which she had mostly gotten used to, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't difficult at all. "I owe you a proper agreement," he said. "Written. What you're owed in wages, what your role is, what your rights are if circumstances change." "Yes," she said. "You do." "I should have done it at the start." "You should have." He held her gaze. "I'll have it drawn up this week." She nodded. She got up and began clearing the table, and he sat there for a moment longer, and she was aware of him in the room the way you become aware of something you've been carefully not looking at directly. "Hart is—" He stopped. Tried again. "He's a man who mistakes knowing someone's circumstances for knowing their character." Clara set the bowls in the basin. "Most people are." She heard him push his chair back, heard him stand. He stopped on his way out of the kitchen and said, "The stew was good." She almost said thank you. She said instead, "There's more if the hands need it." A pause. "I'll let them know." His boots crossed the floor and the back door closed, and Clara stood at the basin in the lamplight and listened to the quiet that was, very gradually, becoming something other than empty. She had not fixed this family. She hadn't come here to fix anything. She had come here because she had been left no alternative, and she had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like confirming everything Harold Whitmore had believed about her, that she was the kind of thing you moved from place to place until she wore out her welcome. But something was happening here that she hadn't budgeted for. Something small and persistent, the way water works on stone. Not dramatic, not announced, just consistent pressure over time. She washed the bowls. She banked the fire. She climbed the stairs and stopped outside Millie's door and listened for a moment. Steady breathing, quiet. And then went to her own room and sat on the edge of her proper bed with its two quilts and looked at the cedar wall in the dark. She had told Ethan Cole on the wagon ride in, "I'm not going to run." She hadn't known then what she was promising. She was beginning to understand it now. And the thing that kept surprising her, the thing she had not prepared herself for at all, was that she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. The written agreement Ethan had promised arrived on a Wednesday, drawn up by the land office clerk in town, and signed by both of them at the kitchen table while Millie sat across from them eating an apple and watching with the focused interest of someone attending an important ceremony she didn't fully understand. It was not a complicated document. It named Clara's wage, her role, her right to 30 days' notice before any change in the arrangement. It named the room as hers for the duration of her employment. It named, at Clara's request, that she was entitled to 2 half-days per week that were her own, to use as she chose. Ethan had not objected to any of it. He had read through the document once, asked her one question, "Is there anything missing?" And when she said no, he signed it. She folded her copy and put it in the wooden box where she kept the things that mattered, alongside her mother's recipe for fever tea and a small photograph of her parents she'd kept hidden from Harold, because some things you just don't leave accessible to men who see no value in anything they can't use. The agreement didn't change the daily shape of her life at the ranch. But it changed something else, some interior calibration she hadn't known was off until it corrected. She was not a transaction anymore, or at least not entirely. She was a person with a signed piece of paper that said she had rights in this place, and that mattered in ways she didn't try to explain to anyone. February blew itself out in a final furious week of storms, and then cracked into something that wasn't quite spring, but wasn't deep winter either. That strange in-between stretch where the snow softened at the edges during the day and refroze at night into a crust you could almost walk on. The cattle were miserable with it, breaking through and sinking, and the ranch hands were out constantly dealing with the resulting problems. Ethan was home less than he'd been in January, which meant the household ran on Clara's management alone, which suited her fine. She had learned the rhythm of it by now. The stove, the water pump with its specific sequence, Rose's shoes scattered through the downstairs rooms like a trail of evidence, Caleb's habit of doing his chores without being asked, but also without telling anyone they were done, so that she'd learn to check rather than wonder. Millie's weather sense. The child had some interior barometer that Clara couldn't explain, but 2 days before a real storm hit, Millie would get quiet and stay close to whatever adult was nearest, and Clara had learned to pay attention to that. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun teaching Rose to cook. It started by accident, or what passed for accident, in a situation where Clara was beginning to suspect very little happened by accident with Rose. The girl had begun appearing in the kitchen during the late afternoon in the particular way children appear when they want something but haven't decided whether to want it out loud. Clara had started handing her small tasks. Stir this, measure that, hold this bowl. And Rose had done each one with the concentrated precision of someone who took new skills seriously. "You have a good instinct," Clara told her one afternoon, watching Rose adjust the heat under a pan without being told to. Rose glanced up. "My mother used to let me help." Clara nodded and didn't make more of it than that. She'd learned that the right response to those moments was usually nothing elaborate, just acknowledgement, and then the work continuing. What she hadn't been prepared for was how much it would matter to her. Standing in that kitchen in the February light with this girl beside her, both of them focused on something practical and real. It was not what she had expected her life to look like at 18. But it was real in a way that the past 3 years of Harold Whitmore's house had never been. She was here, actually here, and the things she did each day had weight to them. It was Caleb who surprised her most in those weeks. The fence wire she'd asked about in January had eventually needed dealing with, and she'd gone out to assess it herself one morning when Ethan and the hands were occupied elsewhere. She was crouched down looking at a section that had pulled loose from the post, turning over the options in her mind, when she heard boots behind her in the snow. Caleb was standing 5 feet back, watching her. He had his coat on and a pair of work gloves, and he was carrying the wire tool from the barn. "You'll need this," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the fence. "Can you show me how?" she asked. He was 12, not 20, and she was 18 and not entirely ignorant of fence repair, but she had learned enough about this particular boy to know that being needed was not something he experienced enough of. He crossed to the fence without comment and showed her how the post anchor worked, which was slightly different from what she'd seen before, and they repaired the section together in the cold with their breath-making small clouds. When they were done, he stepped back and assessed the work the way his father did. A quick visual check, thorough but efficient. "That'll hold," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. "I would have gotten it wrong." "Probably," he agreed, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile but was the thing that lives just next to one. They walked back to the house and she made him a cup of hot coffee. Real coffee, not the weak stuff, because he was 12 and had just done a man's work in the cold, and he deserved it. And he sat at the kitchen table and drank it without making any comment about being given coffee, which in itself said something. That was the afternoon she understood that Caleb Cole was going to be all right. Not easily, not soon, but eventually. The walls he'd built were not made to last forever. They were made because he needed them right now, and when he didn't need them, they would come down in the same quiet way they'd gone up. She didn't say any of this to Ethan. She wasn't sure how. March came in on the back of 3 relatively calm days, and then on the 4th day the temperature dropped so fast and so far that it felt like the world had made a decision. By nightfall there was ice on the inside of the downstairs windows, which Clara had not seen before at the Cole house, and took as a bad sign. She built the fire up as high as it was safe to go, and checked all the outer doors and banked the kitchen stove, and put extra quilts on all 3 of the children's beds. Millie had been quiet all day. Not the comfortable quiet of a child at ease, but the specific closed-in quiet Clara had learned to read over the past weeks. She'd stayed near Clara from breakfast onward, following her from room to room with the determined low-key attachment of a child who has decided that proximity to a particular person is the only reasonable response to whatever she is feeling. Clara had felt her forehead twice during the afternoon. Normal. Or close enough to normal that she'd talked herself out of worry. By 9 o'clock, she talked herself back into it. Millie was in bed, Caleb and Rose were in their rooms, Ethan was in the front room with his book, when Clara went upstairs to check before she settled for the night. She pushed Millie's door open quietly and stood in the doorway. The child was on her back with the quilt pulled up to her chin. Her breathing was audible from the door. Not the smooth rhythm of deep sleep, but something faster, shallower, with an effort in it that Clara felt in her own chest. She crossed to the bed, sat on the edge, put her hand on Millie's forehead. She had been wrong about normal. The skin under her palm was hot in the specific way that means the body has been working at this for a while, and the fever has built up a head of steam. Not the mild warmth of a child who'd been running around. The serious kind. Millie opened her eyes. They were glassy and slightly unfocused. "Clara." "I'm here," Clara said. "How long have you been feeling bad?" "Since before supper." Her voice was thin. "I didn't want to say." "Why not?" Millie looked at her. "Because when I told Mrs. Patterson I felt sick, she got upset." Clara held Millie's gaze for a moment and then very deliberately did not say what she was thinking about Mrs. Patterson. She brushed the hair back from Millie's face and stood up. "Stay right there," she said. "I'll be back in 2 minutes." She went downstairs. Ethan looked up from his chair when she came into the front room. "Millie's sick," she said. "She has a real fever." He was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. The book was on the floor, which probably wasn't intentional. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that I'm going to start working on it right now. I need willow bark from the medicine cabinet. Do you have any?" "There should be. Ellen kept—" He stopped. The name had come out involuntarily, and he heard it when it landed. He moved past her toward the kitchen. "I'll get it." She followed him, talking as they moved. "I also need the lightest linen cloth you have, and clean water, and I need you to tell me if she's had a fever like this before." "Once." He was opening the medicine cabinet above the pantry, scanning through it. "Last winter. Ellen. Her mother managed it." His hands moved through the bottles and tins. "The doctor in town is 2 hours out in good weather." "What's the weather doing?" He looked at her. She already knew the answer. She had known it when she'd felt the ice on the inside of the windows. "Okay," she said. "We handle it here." He found the willow bark. She took it from him, checked the quantity. Not much, but enough for tonight if she stretched it, and went to work. She had learned most of what she knew about fevers from her mother, who had learned it from her own mother before her, and who had held the practical view that medicine was something you used when you had it and improvised when you didn't, and that the two skills were equally important. She made a willow bark tea, not too strong, and sweetened it enough that Millie would drink it without fighting her. She made a compress from the linen cloth in cold water. Ethan carried Millie downstairs to the room beside the kitchen because it was the warmest room in the house. He laid her on the narrow bed there with the same careful deliberateness Clara had seen when he'd carried her sleeping from the kitchen chair 2 months ago, and he stood back and watched Clara set to work with an expression on his face that she couldn't look at directly. She had seen that expression before, or rather she had read about it in one of the notes from the wooden box. He goes somewhere else when he's scared. Not away. He's there in the room, but something behind his eyes goes very far from the situation. You have to call him back. She didn't call him back directly. She said, without looking up from Millie, "Can you sit on that side? Talk to her." "About what?" "Anything." She wrung out the compress. "Tell her about the ranch. Tell her about the horses. She likes hearing you talk about the horses." He pulled the chair to the other side of the bed and sat down. There was a long pause. Then his voice came, low and even. "The gray mare is going to foal soon, probably within the month. She's been getting broad through the middle. You can see it if you look sideways at her in the morning light." Millie's eyes opened part way. "Is it going to be gray too?" Might be darker. Hard to say until it's here." Millie considered this. "I want to name it." "You can name it," Ethan said. "I already have a name." "Okay. I'm not going to tell you yet." Something crossed Ethan's face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something older and more careful than a smile. The expression of a man who has been very frightened and has found a small thing to hold on to. "All right," he said. "When you're ready." Clara applied the compress and Millie's eyes fell closed again, and the room was quiet, except for the storm working itself against the walls of the house and the sound of the fire going in the kitchen. The night was long. Fevers have a rhythm, which is something you learn by sitting through them. They build and they plateau, and sometimes they break and sometimes they don't. And the waiting is the worst part because it requires you to be present for all of it and useful in only some of it, and the rest of the time you simply have to sit there and hold the space and not give way to the fear that is always available to you if you want it. Clara did not give way to it. She was afraid. She would have been a fool not to be. But she kept the fear in a separate compartment and only acknowledged it when she was in the kitchen refreshing the compress or checking on the willow bark, in the 30-second intervals when she was alone and could afford it. At midnight, the fever climbed. She could feel it in Millie's skin under the cloth, that specific awful heat that tells you the body is working too hard. Millie's breathing had gotten more labored and her restlessness had increased, the small thrashing of a child, uncomfortable in her own skin. Ethan was still in the chair on the other side of the bed. He had been there since 9 o'clock. He had not eaten. He had not slept. Clara had put a cup of coffee at his elbow around 10, and he had drunk it without seeming to notice. "Talk to me about what to do," he said at some point after midnight. His voice was very controlled in the way that costs a person something. "We keep the fever from climbing higher," Clara said. "Cool compresses? The tea when she'll take it. Keep her warm, but not too warm. And we watch." She paused. "The fever itself isn't the enemy. It's her body fighting something. Our job is to help it do that without burning her out." "How do you know this?" "My mother." She was changing the compress as she spoke, working efficiently, hand steady. She had a whole system. She kept notes too. She glanced up at him. "Your wife did the same." Something moved across his face. "You read them." "Rose gave them to me. In January." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know Rose had them." "Rose had a lot of things she didn't know how to offer you." It was a direct thing to say to a man at 1 in the morning over his sick child. She watched him absorb it. He didn't get defensive. He looked at Millie and then back at Clara and said quietly, "I know." "She's not trying to protect you from them," Clara said. "She's trying to figure out when it's safe to give them." He said nothing else. He put his hand over Millie's hand on top of the quilt and held it, and Clara went back to the compress. Around 2 in the morning, Caleb appeared in the doorway in his nightclothes. He looked at his sister in the bed and at his father in the chair and at Clara managing the space between them, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "How bad is it?" he said. "Manageable," Clara said. "I need you to go back to bed." I'm not tired. Caleb. He looked at her. She looked back. There was a brief negotiation that happened entirely in eye contact, and then he said, "Can I sit in the kitchen? I won't bother anyone." She thought about it. "Yes, there's leftover cornbread on the counter if you're hungry." He went to the kitchen. She heard him settle into a chair. She heard, after a few minutes, the quiet sound of him eating something, and it struck her as one of the most human sounds she had encountered in months. A 12-year-old boy, too worried to sleep, eating cornbread at 2 in the morning while his sister fought a fever 10 feet away. Rose appeared at 3. Clara sent her back upstairs, less gently than she'd sent Caleb, because Rose's face when she'd seen Millie was the face of a child about to tip into a panic that wouldn't help anyone, and sometimes kindness looked like firmness. "She's going to be all right," Clara said to Rose at the foot of the stairs. "I need you to believe that and go sleep so you're not exhausted tomorrow. Can you do that?" Rose's jaw was tight. "You're sure?" Clara was not entirely sure, but she had enough certainty to give her some. "I'm sure enough," she said. "Go." Rose went. The fever broke at 4:15. Clara felt it change under her hands. The quality of the heat shifting from that hard, relentless build to something that softened, released, became simply warmth rather than a fire that was getting out of hand. Millie's breathing smoothed. Her body stopped fighting itself and went slack in the particular way of deep exhaustion after a sustained effort. Clara sat back in her chair and let herself breathe all the way down for the first time in hours. Ethan was watching her from across the bed. He looked like a man who had been through a sustained physical effort. Not quite pale, but drained. The face you had after the thing that scared you had passed, and your body was catching up to the news. "It broke," Clara said. He put his face in his hands, not crying, just sitting there with his hands over his face for a long moment, the gesture of a man who needed to not be looked at for a few seconds. Clara looked at Millie instead, watching the rise and fall of her chest, small and steady. When Ethan took his hands away, his face was composed again, or mostly composed, in the way of a man who has a long practice of composing it. "She'll sleep now," Clara said. "The fever will probably be lower when she wakes up. She'll need to drink as much as we can get into her tomorrow, and she'll be weak for a few days." Ethan nodded. "You should sleep," she said. "I'll stay with her." "You've been up all night." "So have you. But one of us has a ranch to run tomorrow, and it's not me." He looked at her for a moment with that unreadable quality she'd gotten slightly better at reading. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name without a title in front of it. She registered it and kept her expression neutral. "Thank you," he said. She could have said, "You're welcome." She said instead, "She's worth it." He stood up slowly, like the man whose joints had settled during a long, cold wait. He looked at Millie once more, long and specific, the way you look at something you almost lost. Then he walked out of the room, and Clara heard his boots on the stairs, and then quiet. Caleb was asleep in the kitchen chair, his head on his folded arms on the table, the cornbread plate empty beside him. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him for a moment. This boy who had come down in the middle of the night because he couldn't stay away from his family when they were in trouble. And she felt something in her chest that had no useful name. She got the quilt from the back of the chair by the stove and draped it over his shoulders without waking him. Then she went back to Millie's room, sat down in her chair, and waited for morning. The morning came in pale and cold and quiet, the storm having worked itself out overnight, and Millie woke up at 7 with her fever lowered to something manageable, and her first words being a request for water, and her second words being, after she'd drunk most of the cup, "Is the gray mare okay?" "The gray mare is fine," Clara said. Millie seemed satisfied with this. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. "I was sick." "You were. Were you here all night?" "I was." Millie considered this. Then she said, with the directness that was one of the most specific things about her, "You didn't have to do that." "No," Clara said. "I didn't have to." Millie looked at her. "Why did you?" Clara looked back at this 6-year-old who was asking a genuine question and deserved a genuine answer. "Because you matter to me," she said. "That's all." Millie reached out and put her small hand over Clara's, which was resting on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything. She closed her eyes and went back to sleep holding Clara's hand, and Clara sat there and let her. And outside the window the February light was thin and cold, and the ranch was waking up around them. She heard Ethan's boots in the kitchen above the low sound of the stove, and Caleb's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and then a longer silence, and then Ethan's voice, also too low to hear the words but clear in its intention. She heard Caleb say louder, "She stayed up all night, Pa." And then Ethan's voice, still too low. And then nothing, and then the back door, and then the sound of the ranch hands starting their morning, and the gray world outside the window beginning to shift towards something that wasn't quite warmth, but was at least the absence of the worst of the cold. Millie's hand was small and loose in hers. Clara did not move it. She thought about her mother's notes, the ones about fevers, the ones that lived in her memory, the same way her mother's voice did, practical and direct. The notes of a woman who believed that knowledge was the thing you gave people when you couldn't give them safety. She thought about the box of a dead woman's observations sitting in her room upstairs, and the girl who had offered it to her because she'd decided Clara was trying in good faith. She thought about Ethan Cole sitting in that chair across from her for 6 hours in the middle of the night, hand over Millie's hand, asking what to do and then doing it, the specific, unlikely courage of a man who doesn't know how to ask for help, discovering that sometimes you don't need to know how. You just have to stay in the room. She sat there and waited for Millie to wake up again, and she listened to the sounds of the house around her, and she understood that something had changed in the night. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to specifically, but changed the way ice changed in early spring. Not gone yet, but altered at the core, made different by something that couldn't be undone. She understood that this place, which she had come to because she'd been left no choice, which she had decided to survive out of stubbornness and not much else, had somewhere in the past 3 months become something she did not have a clean name for. She was not ready to name it yet. She filed it away, the same way she filed away the things she wasn't ready to look at directly, and she sat with Millie's hand in hers and waited for the morning to finish arriving. Millie recovered slowly, the way children do when their bodies have genuinely worked hard, not the quick bounce back of a mild cold, but the gradual returning of color and appetite and noise over the course of 4 or 5 days, each one a little more herself than the one before. By the 3rd day, she was sitting up in bed demanding to know if the gray mare had eaten her morning feed. By the 4th day, she had migrated back to the kitchen table and was eating porridge with the focused determination of someone making up for lost time. By the 5th day, she followed Clara through the entire morning routine without being asked, carrying things that were too big for her arms without complaint, talking continuously about the foal and what she intended to name it, and why the name she had chosen was better than any name anyone else might come up with, which was a conversation that didn't require much participation from Clara and suited them both fine. Ethan watched all of this from whatever distance he happened to be at when it occurred. He watched Millie at the kitchen table. He watched her follow Clara through the house. He watched in the particular way of a man who has been frightened badly and is taking inventory of what he still has, counting it carefully, not quite trusting the count. He had not said anything more to Clara beyond the ordinary exchanges of a household running, practical questions, practical answers, the daily logistics of a working ranch in early spring. But something had shifted in how he occupied the same space as she did. He no longer moved past her as though navigating around a piece of furniture. He made room. He waited for her to finish speaking before he spoke. Small things, the kind of things that accumulate into something before you realize you're counting them. Clara noticed. She filed it away with the other things she wasn't ready to look at directly and kept moving. The gray mare foaled on a Thursday in the 2nd week of March. Millie was there for it, which had required a brief negotiation between Millie and Ethan that Clara had witnessed from the kitchen doorway without involvement. Millie making her case in the direct, specific way she made all her cases. Ethan holding out for approximately 4 minutes before he conceded, which was about 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than Clara had expected him to last. Caleb helped with the foaling itself, working alongside the ranch hand who knew what he was doing, and afterward the 5 of them stood in the barn in the cold morning and looked at the foal. Dark, as it turned out, not gray, and Millie announced that its name was Button. Nobody argued with her. Walking back to the house afterward, Ethan fell into step beside Clara while the children ran ahead. He said without preamble, "She wouldn't have been there for that if not for you." Clara glanced at him. She would have recovered regardless. Maybe. He put his hands in his coat pockets. I'm not good at saying these things. I know. I'm trying to say it anyway. She looked at the path ahead of them, the children's footprints already disappearing into the snow. Then just say it plainly. You don't need to build up to it. A pause. Then, I underestimated you. When you came here, I thought I needed someone functional, someone to keep the house running. I didn't think about... He stopped. Started again. I didn't think about what it would mean for the children to have someone who actually saw them. Clara was quiet for a moment. Your wife saw them. She did. And then she was gone, and you were trying to keep everything together, and you thought what you needed was a replacement for the function rather than the person. He flinched slightly. Not at the directness. She had a sense he could handle directness, but at hearing it said out plain. Yes, he said. That's an honest mistake, she said. It's also not the one you're making now. He looked at her. You see them, she said. You have been seeing them. You just forgot you were allowed to show it. They reached the porch, and he held the door for her, and she went inside, and neither of them said anything else about it that morning. But the conversation sat in the room with them in the way that certain conversations do. Not intrusively, not uncomfortably, just present. The news about Millie's fever had moved through the community the way news moved in small frontier settlements, which was faster than horses and more thorough than newspapers. By the time March had settled into something approaching thaw, the story had reached a version that Clara didn't entirely recognize as her own. Embellished in places, compressed in others, but consistent in its central point. The young woman at the Cole ranch had sat up through the worst night of that storm and pulled the youngest Cole child through a dangerous fever without a doctor, without giving way, without losing her nerve. She found out how far it had traveled the first Sunday she drove into town, after the weather allowed it. The dry goods counterman, who had been professionally neutral to her since her arrival, offered her a chair while he filled the order, which he had never done before. A woman she recognized from 2 pews over at the community meeting hall, she'd seen her there in January, stopped her near the door and asked how Millie was doing, and her interest appeared to be genuine. Clara answered politely and did not make anything of it. She finished her errands and went back to the wagon. Douglas Hart was standing beside it. He was less formally dressed than the last time she'd seen him, which for some reason made him look larger. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the wagon without expression when she approached, and he straightened up when he saw her. Miss Whitmore, he said. She stopped in front of him. Mr. Hart. Heard about the Cole girl. He said it without particular warmth, but also without the dismissiveness he'd deployed the last time. Heard you handled it. I did what was needed. He studied her for a moment. There was something different in his assessment of her than there had been in February, a recalibration she could feel happening in real time. She didn't find it flattering. Being evaluated more favorably was still being evaluated. I said some things last time, he began. You said what you believed, she said. I'd rather that than politeness. He seemed mildly surprised by this. Still, I may have characterized your situation without full information. You characterized my situation accurately, she said. It wasn't a compliment when you said it, but it was accurate. I was in a bad position. I'm working on improving it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted towards something that might have been respect, or at least its preliminary stages. You're direct, he said, when I need to be. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and stepped back from the wagon. Good day, Miss Whitmore? She climbed up to the seat. Mr. Hart. She drove home and did not congratulate herself because Douglas Hart's revised opinion of her was not something she had worked toward and was not something she needed. But she noted it because it was a signal about the shape the community was taking around her, and Clara had learned a long time ago that understanding the shape of the thing around you was not vanity, it was survival. Plus some. April arrived, and with it the particular exhaustion of a household coming out of winter, when the accumulated postponements of the cold months all announced themselves at once. Fences that had held through the worst of it revealed what the ice had done to them underneath. The kitchen garden, which nobody had touched since the previous fall, needed complete turning and replanting. The chicken coop roof had developed a lean that Ethan's look, when he saw it, suggested had been developing for longer than this winter. Clara added to her ledger, managed the household accounts with the care of someone who had lived under the financial anxiety of a man like Harold Whitmore and had taken specific notes about what not to replicate, and found the spots where the ranch's domestic expenses could be trimmed without cutting what actually mattered. She showed the ledger to Ethan once a week the way they'd agreed, and he reviewed it without comment most weeks, and occasionally asked a question, and once in April said, "You found $40 I didn't know we had," which was accurate and which she took as a compliment even though it hadn't been delivered as one. "You were being charged twice for the salt delivery," she said. "I wrote to the supplier." "And?" "He'll correct it in the May billing." Ethan looked at her over the ledger with an expression she'd started to recognize as his version of impressed, which was subtle enough that she might have missed it in February. "What else did you find?" She told him, item by item, and he listened the whole way through, and at the end of it he said, "I want you to take over the accounts entirely, not just report them, manage them." She looked at him. "That's a significant expansion of what we agreed." "I know. The wage goes up accordingly. Name your number." She named it. He agreed without negotiating. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment and felt something she identified after some examination as satisfaction. Not the thin, relieved kind, the solid kind. The kind that comes from having done something well and being recognized for it by someone whose recognition means something because they don't give it easily. She was not so far gone in sentiment that she forgot who she was or how she'd come to be standing in this kitchen. She remembered. She intended to keep remembering, but she allowed herself 30 seconds of satisfaction, and then she made supper. The community gathering in late April was an annual thing. She gathered, the kind of social event that frontier settlements organized partly for practical reasons and partly because human beings needed, after a winter of isolation, to simply be in a room together. It was held at the largest spread of tables the community hall could accommodate, and people came from the surrounding ranches and the town itself, and a few from further out. And it ran from midday until people decided they were done. Ethan attended every year. He told Clara this the week before and said, without quite making it a question, "The children usually come." "I know," she said. "Rose has been asking what she should wear since Tuesday." Something moved across his face. "I'd like you to come as well." She kept her eyes on the bread she was kneading. "As part of the household?" "As—" He paused. "As whatever you want to call it. I'd like you there." She looked up then. He was standing by the kitchen door with his hat in his hand, which was where he always ended up when he was saying something that cost him something, she'd noticed. The hat was a tell. "All right," she said. She went. She had not spent much time in groups since arriving at the ranch, and walking into the community hall with the Cole family was a particular kind of education in how a community arranges itself around power. Ethan was known, well known, the kind of presence that shifted a room's center of gravity when it arrived. People greeted him. People greeted the children. And they looked at Clara with the range of expressions that a young woman occupying an ambiguous position in a well-known household could expect, some curious, some warm, some calculating, a few with the residual judgment that the original gossip had laid down and hadn't quite been replaced yet. She held herself the way she had learned to hold herself in Harold Whitmore's house. Not defiant, not apologetic, just there, present, taking up exactly the space she occupied and no more and no less. Millie held her hand the entire walk from the door to the first table, which was the kind of endorsement that required no language and communicated clearly to everyone watching. She sat with the children while Ethan moved through the room, doing the necessary social work of a man with his standing. Rose pressed close beside her, and Caleb sat across the table with the studied disinterest of a 12-year-old boy at a community gathering, which meant he was taking in everything and pretending not to. An older woman, 70 or close to it, with the face of someone who had been direct for so long it had become structural, sat down across from Clara without asking, and said, "You're the Whitmore girl." "I am," Clara said. "I'm Margaret Foss. My husband had the Northern Quarter before he died. I run it now." She said it the way you say weather, just fact. "I heard about the Cole girl, the fever. She recovered well. I know, I came to see for myself." Margaret Foss's eyes moved to Millie, who was at that moment explaining to a boy her age why Button was the best full name possible, and then back to Clara. "You did a good thing." "I did what was needed," Clara said, the same thing she'd said to Hart. "People keep saying that," Margaret said, "as though that's a small thing. Most people don't do what's needed. They do what's comfortable and then explain why it was necessary." Clara looked at her. "You're more direct than most people here." At my age, there's no reason not to be. Margaret Foss folded her hands on the table. I want you to know something. There was talk when you arrived. Some of it was unkind. I know. I heard some of it. Some of it was mine, Margaret said. Clara held her gaze. I said you were too young and the arrangement was unsuitable, and I was concerned about the children having a stranger in the house. She said it evenly, without excessive apology. I was wrong about the last part. I'm telling you because you deserve to know it directly. Clara was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it too much, Margaret said. I reserve the right to be wrong again in the future. She stood up. You need anything in this town? You come to me. I know everyone and I owe nobody. She moved away through the crowd, and Clara sat with what had just happened and felt again that particular solid satisfaction, the kind that came from a revised opinion that had been earned rather than given. Caleb was looking at her from across the table. She raised an eyebrow at him. She doesn't like anybody, he said. That's not entirely accurate, Clara said. She's selective. Same thing. It really isn't. He almost smiled. Clara turned back to the room. Douglas Hart arrived an hour into the gathering. She saw him come in, and she saw the moment he registered where Ethan was and moved toward him, and she watched the two men's interaction from across the room with the attention she gave to things that had the potential to become relevant. Their greeting was cordial in the way of men who do business together and don't entirely trust each other, the particular frontier courtesy that means nothing except that neither party is ready to make an open move. She was helping Millie negotiate the dessert table. Millie wanted the largest piece of the apple cake, which was a reasonable aspiration, and Clara was moderating expectations without crushing them. When she heard Hart's voice at a volume that suggested he was talking to Ethan, but didn't object to being heard. Seems like you've got yourself well situated, Hart said. Young woman to run the house, no formal commitment on your part, convenient arrangement. The room didn't stop, but it adjusted. The specific subtle adjustment of people choosing not to look at something while looking at it completely. Ethan said something she couldn't hear, low. Hart said, Come on, Cole, say, everyone knows what it is. You brought a girl in from nowhere and set her up in your house with your kids. She's got nowhere else to go, so she works herself to the bone, and you've got all the advantages with none of the, that's enough. Ethan's voice was quiet. That was what made the room actually go still. Not volume, but the quality under the quiet. Clara had Millie's hand. She didn't move. She kept my daughter alive through a February storm, Ethan said. She's managed my accounts and found money I didn't know I was losing and repaired relationships with my children that I didn't know how to repair myself. A pause. She was not brought here out of convenience. She was brought here because I was drowning and I made the best decision available to me at the time, which was not a good decision, and she has outperformed it by a distance I can't measure. Hart said something she still couldn't hear. She wasn't bought, Ethan said. I'm aware of how it looked. She is aware of how it looked. What happened afterward is what matters. And what happened afterward was that she chose to stay, and she chose to give this family something it didn't have anymore, and I'll stand next to that choice in front of anyone who wants to argue with it. The room was very quiet. Then Ethan turned from Hart and looked across the room and found Clara where she was standing by the dessert table with Millie's hand in hers. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, the specific direct look of a man who has said something publicly that he needed her to have heard. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then Millie tugged at her hand and said, in complete obliviousness to any of the preceding events, Clara, the big piece is still there. Clara looked down at her. Then you'd better take it before someone else does. Millie took the big piece. They drove home in the early evening, the five of them in the wagon, Millie asleep against Clara's arm, before they were a mile out, and Rose quiet on her other side and Caleb up front beside his father, talking about Button in the low voice he used when he wasn't performing indifference. Clara sat with the weight of Millie against her side and watched the landscape go past in the last of the April light, and thought about what Ethan had said. Not the sentiment of it. She'd had time to feel the sentiment and set it somewhere useful, but the specific content. She wasn't bought. She had been. The transaction had happened. The money had been counted on Harold's kitchen table. But what Ethan was saying, and what she was slowly understanding, he believed, was that the transaction was the beginning of the story and not the definition of it. She had told herself since November that she would not let what had happened to her determine what she became here. She had believed it in the defiant, teeth-gritted way she believed most things about herself, as a matter of will rather than genuine confidence. What she hadn't accounted for was that other people could also decide what she was. That the people in that room tonight had watched her come in holding Millie's hand and had made their own assessments, and that those assessments had shifted, and that the shift was real. Millie murmured something in her sleep. Clara adjusted her arm without thinking. Rose said quietly, "He's never done that before," said something like that. "In public." "I know," Clara said. "He doesn't talk about our mother either, not in public." Rose's voice was careful, feeling for the edges of what she was saying. "He keeps things very inside." "That's one way to survive things," Clara said. "Is it a good way?" Clara considered the question seriously, the way Rose's questions usually deserved. "It works for a while," she said, "and then it needs help." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to stay?" The question landed with the simplicity that only children managed, the kind of question that cut straight past everything circumstantial to the actual thing. Clara looked at the darkening sky over the wagon. She stopped. "That's not entirely my decision." "It could be," Rose said. "We'll see." Rose accepted this without further pressure, which was its own kind of maturity. She leaned slightly against Clara's shoulder, not quite the way Millie did. Millie attached herself fully and without reservation, but a small, deliberate contact. An offering. They rode the rest of the way home in the particular quiet that comes after a long day when everyone is too tired to perform anything and can just exist in the same space without effort. And when they pulled up to the ranch, Caleb helped with the horse, and Ethan carried Millie inside, and Clara got Rose upstairs and checked that both girls were settled before she went back down to the kitchen to bank the fire. Ethan was already there, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. He had his back to the door, but he heard her come in. "You should have said something," Clara said. "In there, before he made it public." Ethan turned. "I should have said it months ago." She sat down at the table. "What does it change?" He sat down across from her, the same table where they'd signed the agreement in February, the same table where she'd found the ledger and the accounts, and the accumulated proof that this household had been running on less than it needed. "Whatever you want it to change," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "I'm not the same person I was when I drove out of Harold Whitmore's yard," she said. "I'm not going to pretend that what happened here hasn't mattered to me. It has." She folded her hands on the table. "But I need you to understand what this would mean. It's not simple." "No," he said. "It isn't. Your children are starting to trust me. If that changes—" "It won't change," he said. "You don't know that. You can't promise." "Clara." He said her name the same way he had said it in the small hours of the fever night, with the same quiet weight. I know what I'm saying." She studied him in the lamplight, the difficult, unreadable face she'd spent months learning to read. She was better at it now. She could see, in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands on the table, that this was not an impulsive man saying an impulsive thing. This was a man who had been turning something over for a long time and had finally found the words for it. "I need time," she said. "I know. Not because I don't—" She stopped. "Because I need to make a decision like this from a place where I'm sure it's a decision, not a reaction, not relief, a decision." "Take what you need," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then she nodded once and stood up and said goodnight, and walked upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She was 18 years old. She had been sold like a negotiable asset and had turned the transaction into something she had not anticipated and could not have planned. She had kept 3 children fed and warm and increasingly, tentatively intact. She had sat through a February fever night on stubbornness and her mother's notes and come out the other side. She had been talked about by strangers and had held her own in a dry goods store and had earned the specific respect of a woman who didn't give it to anyone. She was 18 years old and she had never, until this winter, understood what it felt like to matter somewhere. She sat with that for a long time in the dark. Outside the window, the April night was cold and quiet, and below her the house settled into its nighttime sounds. The tick of the cooling stove, the wind working quietly against the eaves, the ordinary sounds of a place that had become, without her entirely meaning to let it, home. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for it, or she'd used up whatever she had in the years at Harold's and hadn't replenished the supply. But she sat in the dark for a long time, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the hard parts, not the fear or the transaction or the cold of the first night in a stranger's house, but the other thing. The thing she'd been so careful not to name, because naming something makes it real, and real things can be taken away. She let herself feel it, and then she lay down on her bed, and she looked at the cedar ceiling in the dark. And for the first time since November, she fell asleep without having to work at it. She had told Ethan she needed time, and she meant it, and she took it. Not in the way of someone stalling or avoiding, more in the way of someone who has learned, through hard and specific experience, that the decisions you make from relief look exactly like the decisions you make from clarity until they don't, and by then you are living inside the consequences, and there is no clean way back out. She had made enough choices in her life that were really just responses to pressure. She wanted this one, whatever it turned out to be, to belong entirely to her. So April continued the way April did on a working ranch, muddy and relentless and full of the accumulated demands of everything winter had postponed. And Clara continued the way Clara did, which was to move through each day with the specific attention she'd learned to give it. She managed the household and the accounts and the children's various needs and the kitchen garden that was finally showing green along the south wall. She and Ethan were careful with each other in the days after the community gathering, not coldly, not with any retreat from what had passed between them, but with the deliberate patience of two people who have said significant things and are giving them room to settle. The children were not careful. Children rarely were. Millie, who had fully recovered her color and her volume and her strong opinions about Button's daily schedule, had taken to sitting between Clara and Ethan at the supper table whenever possible, which required some rearranging of chairs that she accomplished with the specific obliviousness she could deploy when she needed to. Caleb had begun talking to Clara in full sentences unprompted, which was its own landmark. Rose had started coming to her at night sometimes, not for anything in particular, just to sit in Clara's room and read or talk or simply be quiet together, the way you were with someone you trusted enough not to perform for. Clara watched all of it and felt the familiar complexity of caring about things you couldn't fully protect. She wrote to Harold Whitmore once in April. Not a long letter. Not an emotional one. She wrote that she was well, that she was employed, that she did not require anything from him and did not anticipate contacting him again. She did not write what she felt, which was a cold and specific satisfaction at being able to write to him at all, at having survived the winter he'd driven her into and come out the other side with more than she'd had going in. She sealed the envelope and mailed it from town on a Tuesday and did not think about him again, which was not as hard as she'd expected. She thought instead about a question Rose had asked her in the wagon coming home from the gathering, the one that had landed with such uncomplicated accuracy she'd been unable to shake it since. "Are you going to stay?" The question assumed something Clara had spent months treating as fragile, that staying was a choice she was in a position to make. She'd come to the coal ranch with no alternatives and had survived by telling herself that survival was the goal. She hadn't let herself want more than survival, because wanting more than you had looked, from the inside of Harold Whitmore's house, like the fastest route to disappointment. But she was not in Harold Whitmore's house anymore. She was in a house where a 6-year-old girl had held her hand through the night of a fever without being asked. She was in a house where a 12-year-old boy had taught her to fix a fence in the cold, and then stood back with something close to satisfaction at having been useful. She was in a house where a 9-year-old girl had given her a dead woman's private notes because she had decided Clara was trustworthy enough to hold them. She was in a house where a man had stood up in front of his entire community and said, flatly, without performance, without looking around to see how it was landing, that she had not been bought, that she had been chosen. She understood sometime in the second week of May that she had already made the decision. She had made it months ago, in pieces, without realizing she was making it. She'd made it the morning she reorganized the kitchen cupboards without saying a word to anyone. She'd made it the night she draped a quilt over a sleeping boy who'd come downstairs because he was scared and wouldn't say so. She'd made it the afternoon she sat with a dead woman's handwriting and understood she'd been given something that couldn't be given lightly. The understanding arrived not as revelation, but as recognition. The way you recognize a road you've been walking for a while, when you finally look up and see where it goes. She found Ethan in the barn on a Thursday evening in the second week of May, checking on Button, who was at the stage of young horse development where she was mostly legs and opinions. He heard Clara come in and turned, and she stood in the barn doorway with the evening light behind her and said, I've made up my mind. He waited. He was good at waiting. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I could find somewhere else to go, I know that now, because I want this, these children, this place. She paused and let the last part carry its own weight. You. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously, with the full consideration he didn't give to things that didn't matter to him. Button shifted in the stall beside him, and neither of them looked at the horse. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. When I went to your uncle's house in November, he said, I told myself I was solving a practical problem. I needed someone, and the arrangement was transactional. I knew it, and I did it anyway. He looked briefly at his hands, the way he looked at his hands when he was trying to be accurate about something. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to be honest yet, was that I had stopped being able to look at this house after Ellen died. I could walk through it and manage it and keep the children in it, but I couldn't look at it. It felt like a place that was finished. Clara did not move. You didn't fix that, he said. I want to be accurate. That's not something you could do, and it wouldn't have been fair to ask it of you, but something shifted because you were here. The house started being present again, like something still happening, rather than something that had stopped. He looked at her. I noticed it, and I didn't want to notice it, because noticing required me to be honest about what I had done to you. And what I had done was not something I was ready to be honest about. She thought about the man on the wagon in the blizzard who had said, I'm afraid of failing them to a stranger he'd met 4 hours prior. She thought about how that had been, from the very beginning, the most human thing about him. You're being honest about it now, she said. I'm trying to be. That's enough, she said. That's all I need. He crossed the barn in 3 steps, and she met him in the space between them, which had been maintained so carefully for 5 months by 2 people who were more cautious than they needed to be and less certain than they felt, simply closed. They married in June. It was not a large affair, not because they had anything to hide or any remaining uncertainty about what they were doing, but because neither of them was built for spectacle, and the children were the more important audience anyway. The ceremony was at the community hall with the justice of the peace, and a gathering of people who had, over the course of the winter and spring, shifted from judgment to something closer to genuine witness. Margaret Foss was there in a good dress, and the expression of someone attending an event she had decided to find satisfactory. The ranch hands came. A handful of families from the surrounding area who had known the Coles for years and who had understood through the specific intelligence of frontier communities more about what had happened at that ranch over the past winter than Clara would ever fully know. Millie wore a dress with a sash and informed everyone at the reception that Button was doing extremely well, which was not directly relevant to the occasion, but was delivered with such conviction that it became its own kind of wedding toast. Rose helped Clara with her hair that morning, working with the careful focus that was very like Rose in everything. No wasted movement, genuine concentration, the specific tenderness of someone who didn't offer it broadly and meant it completely when she did. You look nice, Rose said when she was done. She was 9 years old and was considering Clara in the mirror with the critical eye of an artist assessing a finished work. You look like yourself, but better. Clara looked at herself in the mirror. She had a dress she'd bought in town in May, a real one, the first piece of clothing she'd bought for herself in longer than she could clearly remember that wasn't purely functional. She looked like a young woman who had been through a hard winter and a longer road before that and had arrived somewhere she hadn't expected to arrive at. She looked like someone who had survived. More than that, she looked like someone who had chosen. Thank you, she said to Rose, and meant it for more than the hair. Caleb was downstairs when they came down, wearing his good shirt and already arranging his expression into the stoic patience of someone prepared to endure a social occasion. He looked at Clara when she came into the room, and his expression shifted in the specific way she'd learned to read in him, the one that meant something mattered, but he wasn't going to be dramatic about it. You look fine, he said. High praise, Clara said. I mean it. I know you do. He glanced away and back, and then he said, with the careful effort of a 12-year-old boy saying something he'd been working toward for a while, I'm glad you didn't run. Clara looked at him. He looked back, steady, not hiding from it. Me too, she said. Millie appeared from the kitchen at that moment with a biscuit in one hand and an expression of complete satisfaction with the morning. She looked at Clara and then said, "You look like a picture." "That's the idea," Caleb said. "I wasn't talking to you," Millie said. Clara laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came up without permission. And Caleb almost smiled, and Millie finished her biscuit with the dignity of someone who has made their point, and outside the June morning was clear and warm and waiting. The valley where Ellen Cole had planted wildflowers was south of the ranch, down a long slope through a stand of cottonwoods, and it bloomed in late June with the specific extravagance of a place that had been tended and then gone wild, and had arrived at something between the two. Ethan had not been back since Ellen died. He had mentioned this to Clara once, simply, the way he mentioned difficult things, as fact rather than as invitation. She had suggested they go. Not to mark anything formal, not with any ceremony attached, just to go. To let the children see it. To let him see it and have it be something other than an absence. They went on a Saturday in late June, all 5 of them. The day was clear and warm in the specific Wyoming way of early summer where the warmth was still young enough to feel like a gift rather than a demand. The children ran ahead through the cottonwoods and their voices came back through the trees in pieces. Millie's high and continuous, Rose's occasional and laughing at something Millie had done, Caleb's lower and punctuated by the particular short sound he made when something was funnier than he intended to find it. Ethan walked beside Clara. They didn't talk much on the walk down. They didn't need to, which was something she had come to deeply appreciate about him. He was a man who could be quiet without making the quiet uncomfortable, who didn't fill silences out of nervousness. She had spent enough of her life in silences loaded with unspoken things to know the difference between those and the kind that were simply space. This was the latter. Room for things to be what they were. When they came through the cottonwoods into the valley, the wildflowers were doing exactly what wildflowers did in a place they'd been encouraged, blooming without plan or orderliness, in colors that didn't coordinate and were more real for it, yellows and purples, and the particular bright orange of something she didn't know the name of, running along the slope in the uneven way of things that had seated themselves exactly where they wanted. Millie stopped at the edge of it and went quiet, which was unusual enough for Millie that both Caleb and Rose stopped too. "Mama planted these?" Millie said. "She did," Ethan said. "She spent 2 springs getting them started." Millie looked at the flowers for another moment with the focused consideration she gave important things. Then she walked into them, not recklessly, but with the deliberate intention of a child who has decided something is real and wants to be inside it. She moved through the yellow and purple with her arms slightly out, the way you move through water. Rose followed. Caleb stood at the edge longer, looking at the whole of it. Then he said, without turning, "She would have liked that they're still here." "Yes," Ethan said. "She would have." A beat. Then Caleb walked in. Clara stood beside Ethan at the edge of the valley and watched his 3 children move through the flowers his late wife had planted, and she felt the specific complexity of a moment that was beautiful and sad and true all at once. The kind of moment that didn't resolve into one thing and wasn't supposed to, the kind you had to hold in all its contradictions or not hold at all. "You all right?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Another pause. "It's different than I expected." "Different how?" He looked at the valley, then at her. "I thought it would feel like the same pain. It doesn't." He turned to look at her. "It feels like she did something that outlasted her, which she did." He was quiet again. "That's not the same as loss." "No," Clara said. "It's not." She took his hand. Not for any reason beyond the simple fact of it, because they were standing at the edge of something that deserved to be stood at with another person, and because she was the person standing next to him, and because somewhere between November and June that had become not an arrangement, but simply a fact of where she was in the world. They stood there, and down the slope Millie had started picking flowers with the cheerful indiscrimination of a child, assembling a bouquet according to her own system, and Rose was helping her identify which stems to choose, and Caleb was standing in the middle of the valley, looking at something in the distance that probably only he could see. And the light was long and warm, and the flowers bloomed in all their uncoordinated colors because nobody had told them to be anything other than what they were. Clara stood there and let herself be in it, all of it, the beauty and the grief and the life continuing inside and around both. She had spent so many years bracing for the ground to move under her that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand on it, It felt like this. There is a particular thing that happens to people who are told, early and often, and by the people who are supposed to know better, that they are less than they are. It works on you the way cold works on stone. Not dramatically, not all at once. Nothing you can point to at a specific moment and say that's where it started. It works slowly, constantly, and over enough time it changes the shape of the thing it's working on. You don't look different from the outside, but you have been altered in ways you don't yet know how to measure. Clara had been shaped by Harold Whitmore's house in ways she was still discovering years later, some smaller than she'd feared and some larger than she'd known. She had carried into the Cole household the ingrained instincts of someone who expected the ground to shift, who kept one foot back at all times, who maintained a careful interior distance between herself and anything she was at risk of needing. She did not call this fear. She called it practicality. But it was fear, and it had kept her upright through 3 years of a man who had never once asked how she was sleeping, and she did not entirely fault herself for it. What she hadn't known, because you cannot know it until it happens, was what it would feel like to put it down. Not all at once. She wasn't built for that, and she wasn't sure she'd want to be even if she could. But piece by piece, in the specific moments that required something more than armor. The first morning she made biscuits in a kitchen that wasn't hers and chose to make them well anyway. The afternoon she read a dead woman's notes and felt the weight of being given a trust. The night she sat through the hours of Millie's fever without giving way, not because she was unafraid, but because the fear was less important than staying. The moment at the kitchen table when she told Ethan what she needed instead of waiting to see what was offered. Each of those moments had cost her something, had required her to be a little more present and a little less defended. And each time she had waited for what she had always been waiting for. The withdrawal, the discovery that the ground she was standing on had been borrowed rather than given. It hadn't come. And piece by piece, over the long months of that Wyoming winter, she had become someone who could stand in a valley holding a man's hand and feel the full weight of where she was without simultaneously bracing for it to end. She was not a finished person. She was not a healed person, not in the clean, complete sense of the word. She still woke sometimes in the dark with the particular anxiety of someone who spent her formative years waiting for things to be taken away, heart moving fast for reasons her sleeping mind had manufactured from old material. She still caught herself sometimes doing more than was asked because some old part of her believed that was the only insurance against being found dispensable. She was still, in certain moments, more Harold Whitmore's niece than she wanted to be. But she was also, and this was newer, and less certain feeling, and therefore more real, a woman who had built something, who had arrived in a stranger's house in a blizzard with one bag and had turned the transaction of her arrival into something that had her name on a deed and her herbs in a kitchen garden, and her presence threaded so thoroughly through 3 children's daily lives that she had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the person they looked for first when something went wrong. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. In September, a letter arrived from the territory's land office confirming the registration of Clara's name on the South Quarter and the household accounts. She held the folded document in both hands for a moment before opening it, in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the children already at school and the house quiet around her. She had not expected the feeling it produced, which was less like triumph and more like the particular solidity of a thing settling into its permanent place. She had been standing in temporarily for long enough that she had stopped thinking of permanence as something available to her. The letter said otherwise. She put it in the cedar box with the other things that mattered: her parents' photograph, her mother's recipe for fever tea, her original signed agreement with Ethan from February, now yellowed slightly at the fold from being taken out and looked at when she needed to look at something real. The box was getting full. She noticed this and felt it as a kind of measurement. Ethan had come in from the east pasture and found her at the table when the letter arrived. He had washed his hands at the basin and stood there drying them on the cloth and watched her face. "It came," he said. "It came." He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with the attention he brought to things he was taking the measure of. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like something real," she said. "It is something real." "I know." She looked at the letter in her hands. "I grew up in a house where the things that were supposed to be real weren't. You learn to treat the idea of real things with some suspicion." He was quiet, letting her get there. This is real, she said again. Not to him, to herself. Because some things needed to be said out loud by your own voice before they settled all the way in. He poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her, and they sat at the kitchen table in the September morning. And outside the kitchen window, the garden was in its end-of-season abundance, and the house was quiet around them in the way it only was when the children were gone. A specific texture of quiet that she had come to like. Not empty, just resting. Margaret Foss came to call on a Wednesday in late September with a jar of preserved plums and the manner of someone who had decided to like you and was expressing it through practical action rather than declaration. She sat at the cold kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the fall market and the water rights situation developing on the northern quarter and about a family newly arrived from the east who she thought were going to have a hard first winter. Clara listened and asked questions and offered, at the end of it, to put together a supply list with some guidance about what that first Wyoming winter actually required, what you thought you needed and what you actually needed, which were different lists. Margaret looked at her. You couldn't have done that in November, she said. No, Clara agreed. I couldn't. That's not criticism. That's an observation. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup in the manner of someone settling in to say something worth the setup. I've watched a lot of people come to this territory over the years. Some who looked like they'd last and didn't. Some who didn't look like they had any business lasting and did. I've tried to figure out the difference. What did you find? The ones who last are the ones who figure out that the land doesn't care about them, Margaret said. Not cruelly, just the land is what it is. It doesn't bend for anyone. So you either find a way to be in it rather than against it, or you spend yourself fighting something that will outlast you regardless of what you do. She looked at Clara directly. You figured that out faster than most. I had reasons to, Clara said. Most people have reasons to, Margaret said. Most people choose comfort over the lesson anyway. She set her cup down. You need anything in this town, you come to me. I know everyone and I owe nobody. She left with her characteristic efficiency, and Clara stood on the porch and watched her go and sat with what had been said and thought about the difference between a compliment and an accurate assessment and how rare it was to receive the latter from anyone. She went back inside and started supper. October came in on a northwest wind that told her, in the specific animal way she'd developed over the past year, that the winter coming would be serious. She began the preparations she'd been planning since August, earlier than Ethan had started them the year before, methodically working through the list she'd assembled from the notes she'd taken all summer about what they'd run short of in the coldest weeks and what they'd had more of than necessary. Caleb helped her with the root cellar inventory on a Saturday morning. He was 13 by now, had turned 13 in August with the combination of pride and ambivalence that 13 usually brought, and he was noticeably taller than he'd been in November, and noticeably less interested in performing disinterest. He worked through the cellar shelves beside her and called out quantities, and she wrote them down, and at one point he said, without looking up from the shelf he was checking, "Last year we were almost out of lamp oil by February." "I have 4 extra cans coming on the next supply run," Clara said. "I figured you did," he said. She looked at him. He was reading the label on a tin with the focused expression of someone who was not trying to communicate anything specific. "Caleb." "What?" "Thank you for telling me." He glanced at her. "I figured you'd want to know." "I would have wanted to know even if you thought I already knew." He considered this. "Okay. I mean it generally. If you notice something, tell me. I don't always see everything." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelf. Then, "Pa says the same thing to the hands." "Does he?" "He says 2 sets of eyes catch twice as much." He picked up another tin, checked it. "I think that's what he was saying to me, without saying it about me." Clara looked at the boy who had arrived in her life as a 12-year-old wall of protective indifference and was currently standing in a root cellar in October telling her something about his father with the indirect but genuine openness of a person who had decided she was safe to talk to. "He was saying it about you," she said. Caleb nodded, set the tin down, and kept going down the shelf. She went back to her list, but that evening, Ethan came in from the north pasture later than usual and ate his supper with the particular quietness of a man working through something. Clara had learned to let him work. She cleared the table and sent the children upstairs, and when the kitchen was quiet, she sat back down with the household ledger she'd been going through and he poured himself a second coffee and stayed at the table rather than going to the front room. After a while, he said, "Douglas Hart made an offer on the northern quarter." She set down the ledger. "Our northern quarter." "It's not ours. It's territory grazing land, technically, but the access runs through our property." He turned the coffee cup in both hands. "He's been working toward this for a year. If he gets the grazing rights and the access, he controls the water on that side, and he can run cattle through land we've been using as buffer." "Can he do that legally?" "He's trying to find out if he can." Ethan looked at her. "He has a lawyer in Cheyenne looking for the angle." Clara thought about it. "Do we have a lawyer?" "Not currently. We should get one." "I know. I've been putting it off because the cost is significant, and I kept thinking the situation would resolve without it." He stopped. "That's not good thinking." "No," she said. "It isn't." She pulled the ledger back toward her and turned to the accounts pages. "Show me what we have in reserve." He came around the table and sat beside her, and they went through the numbers together at the kitchen table in the lamplight, heads close over the ledger, while the house settled around them and the wind built outside. And Clara felt, in the midst of the specific practical work of protecting what they had, the particular satisfaction of two people working on a problem together with mutual honesty. Neither of them pretending the numbers were better than they were, neither of them panicking at what they actually were. "We can afford a lawyer," she said. "If we move the spring cattle budget like this." She showed him. He studied the column. "That leaves thin margins on the east fence repair. The east fence can be done in sections. It doesn't all have to go at once." She looked at him. "The water access is not a thing that can be done in sections." He was quiet, studying the page. She could see him doing the thing he did when he was accepting an argument he'd resisted, the specific stillness of a man rearranging his thinking. "Write to the Cheyenne office," she said. "I'll draft the letter if you want. Give them the details of the access road and the grazing history, and let them advise us before Hart's lawyer finds an angle we didn't know to look for." "All right," he said. "And Ethan?" He looked at her. "Stop waiting for problems to resolve themselves," she said. Not harshly, just directly. "You're a capable man who runs a capable operation. That doesn't mean problems know to leave you alone. It means you're equipped to deal with them when they don't." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the slight wryness he produced occasionally, like something coming up from a deep place, "You sound like my father." "Was your father right?" "Usually." "Then that's fine," she said, and went back to the ledger. The letter to the Cheyenne Land Office was sent the following week, and the response came back in November with an attorney's name attached and a preliminary assessment of the access road situation that was sufficiently detailed to make Hart's angle significantly more complicated to pursue. The attorney noted that the grazing history Clara had assembled from Ethan's records, which she had gone through thoroughly in October and organized for the first time since they'd been created, constituted an established use claim that would require serious legal challenge to overturn. Hart did not pursue it further that season. Clara had no illusions that he'd abandoned the idea, but she filed the correspondence and the attorney's assessment in the household records she'd created and went on with the winter. The winter was hard, as she had known it would be. Not as catastrophic as the previous one. Nothing in that February category. Nothing that trapped them in isolation for days. But hard in the accumulated way of a Wyoming winter, the long cold weeks, and the work that didn't stop because the temperature did, and the specific endurance required to keep a household and a ranch running when everything in the physical environment was arguing against it. She was better at it than she'd been the year before. Not because the winter was easier, but because she knew it now. She knew the stove's particular behavior in extreme cold. She knew which windows leaked and had dealt with them in the fall. She knew to add a day's worth of supplies to every estimate she'd made last year. She knew which of the children would need most from her in the hard weeks. Millie close to someone warm, Rose needing something to do with her hands to stay grounded, Caleb needing to feel useful. She knew Ethan's tells when he was running on low and hadn't said so, which were different from his normal reserve, and which she had learned to respond to with practical offers rather than emotional inquiries, because he was more able to accept a cup of coffee than an acknowledgement that he looked exhausted, and the coffee accomplished the same thing. She was not a perfect household manager. She made mistakes, ordered too much of one thing and not enough of another, misjudged the speed at which the feed would go through, had a week in January where she was short-tempered with the children in ways she recognized afterward as fatigue she hadn't accounted for in herself. She apologized to each of them specifically, which was apparently unusual enough for Caleb that he looked at her sideways when she did it, and then nodded with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward. She did not apologize to herself. She had spent enough of her life being told she was insufficient without adding her own voice to that. She noted the mistakes, she adjusted for them going forward, and she kept moving. In February, on the anniversary of Millie's fever, Clara sat at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up and thought about where she had been 1 year before. She had been in this same kitchen, in this same chair, coming out of a night that had lasted longer than any night she'd previously sat through, with a child's hand loose in hers and the specific relief of a fever broken, flooding through a body that had been holding itself rigid with the effort of not giving way. She had been 24 hours into understanding what it meant to be willing to spend yourself for something you hadn't been assigned to love, but had chosen to anyway. She was still in this kitchen. The chair was the same, the stove was the same, a little more familiar in its particular behaviors. The house around her was the same house, making its same nighttime sounds in the winter cold. She was not the same. She thought about who she had been in November, arriving in a blizzard at a stranger's house with one bag, and the specific defensive stubbornness of a person who had been told her whole life that she was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay for her. She thought about the girl who had stood in Harold Whitmore's doorway, watching him count bills, and had felt, underneath the rage and fear, the shameful flicker of relief that at least she was leaving. She had deserved better than Harold Whitmore. She had known this, theoretically, in the way you know things that haven't yet been confirmed by experience. What she hadn't known was that better was available, that the world contained, alongside its Harold Whitmores, its Ethan Coles, difficult men, closed men, men who had to be reached by patience rather than expectation, but men who when reached were solid all the way through. That the world contained its Rose Coles, who handed you maps when you didn't know you were lost. Its Caleb Coles, who taught you fence repair in the cold as a way of saying they'd decided you were worth teaching. It's Millie Coles, who held your hand in the night and asked the next morning why you'd stayed, and accepted the true answer without flinching. The world contained more than she'd been allowed to believe when she was living inside Harold Whitmore's narrow version of it. She sat at the kitchen table in the February pre-dawn and held this knowledge, which was simple and enormous and had cost her a winter to earn. Millie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She did this sometimes, came down in the early morning before the others, finding Clara in the kitchen before the household started, and sitting with her in the quiet. She was 7 now, taller, with most of her baby roundness replaced by something more angular, but the eyes were the same. Still the eyes that saw everything and withheld their assessment until they were sure. She climbed into the chair across from Clara and folded her arms on the table and looked at her. "You were up early," Millie said. "I was thinking." "About what?" Clara looked at her. "About last February." Millie was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she went quiet when she was handling something that had weight. "When I was sick." "Yes." "I remember some of it," Millie said. "I remember you were there the whole time." She looked at her hands on the table. "I remember thinking you'd leave to sleep, and you didn't." "I didn't." "Why not?" It was the same question she'd asked a year ago from a sickbed, in a thinner voice. Clara gave her the same answer, because it was still the truest one. "Because you mattered to me." Millie looked up. "Do I still?" Clara felt something move through her chest that had no clean name and needed none. "Every single day," she said. Millie considered this with the seriousness she brought to important things. Then she unfolded herself from the chair and came around the table and climbed, with the casual assurance of someone who has done something many times, into Clara's lap, which she was almost too big for, but not quite, not yet, and settled there. Clara put her arms around her. They sat in the kitchen in the February dark, the fire ticking in the stove, the house quiet around them, and Clara held this child who had not been hers by any plan or assignment or blood and felt the specific truth of what that meant and didn't mean. Not hers by accident or transaction, hers by the accumulated weight of every morning and every supper and every fever night and every ordinary, unremarkable day in which she had been present and chosen to be present and been present again. That was what made a family, not the beginning of it, not the document or the arrangement or the circumstance that brought you into the same house. The choosing, repeated, the staying, the daily decision to be there. Spring came to the Cole Ranch. The way spring always came to that part of Wyoming, reluctantly, then all at once, like something that had been holding back and finally gave up the fight. The snow came off the fields in patches first, then faster, and the mud season arrived with its particular demands. And then one morning, Clara stepped outside, and the air had a quality to it that was unmistakably different from everything that had come before it in the past several months. And she stood on the porch and breathed it in and felt her whole body recognize it before her mind had finished identifying it. New. The kitchen garden was planted by the end of April, larger than last year, expanded along the east wall with the confidence of someone who now knew what grew well and what didn't and had opinions about both. The herbs along the south side, the tomatoes in the sunnier stretch, room for the squash to do whatever it was going to do, because last year she had underestimated the squash, and she wasn't going to make that mistake twice. Button was a yearling now, all the awkwardness of foalhood resolved into something beginning to suggest what she would be. Tall, as Millie had always maintained she would be, with a good steady temperament and the specific trust of a horse that has been handled gently from its first days. Millie worked with her every afternoon with the focused pleasure of someone doing what they are naturally suited to, and Clara sometimes watched from the fence and thought about the notes in the cedar box and the woman who had written them, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a trust honored. Caleb had started talking about the land with an intention that was no longer the unfocused interest of a boy, but the specific, accumulating focus of a person forming a direction. He asked Ethan questions in the evenings that were more sophisticated than they'd been in the fall, about the grazing rotation, about the water table, about the long-term implications of various decisions for the health of the range. Ethan answered all of them fully. Clara heard these conversations sometimes from the kitchen, and listened to the sound of a father and a 13-year-old son finding their way into a shared language that was going to outlast the winter and the year and probably several decades, and she felt something very quiet and very large about it. Rose had begun reading everything she could find. The community library, such as it was, had been exhausted. Clara had written to a bookseller in Cheyenne and ordered a box of books that arrived in March to Rose's reception as though a miracle had been delivered to the kitchen table. She had read through all of them by May with the focused speed of someone for whom books were not leisure but necessity, and had begun writing things in the margins. Not annotations exactly, more like arguments. She was 9 years old and was already the kind of thinker who needed to talk back to what she was reading, and Clara thought about what that would need eventually, and began to think about how to make sure it had room to grow. She brought it up to Ethan one evening in May, sitting on the porch in the returning warmth. "Rose needs more than what's here," she said. He looked at her. "More what?" "More school. More books. More room for what's in her head. There's a school in Cheyenne that's open to girls. It's not close, but it's the kind of education that would actually fit her." He was quiet for a while. "She's 9. "Not for long." Another silence. "I'd want to visit it first, see it for myself." "That's reasonable." "And she'd have to want it." "She will," Clara said, "when she knows it exists." He looked at the hills going dark in the distance. "You think about these things for them." "Somebody has to." He turned to look at her, and the look had the quality she'd come to recognize as the one he didn't produce often, and meant entirely when he did. The one that meant something had arrived at its proper place inside him and was resting there. "Ellen would have done this," he said. "Thought this way about Rose." "I know," Clara said. "I read her notes." He was quiet again. Not the closed kind of quiet, the other kind. "I think she'd be glad," he said, "that you're here, that you see them the way you do." Clara looked at the hills. The light was going off them the way it did in early May, slowly, with reluctance. She thought about a woman she had never met who had planted wildflowers and kept notes about her children and left both things for the people who came after her to find and use. "I hope so," she said. They sat on the porch as the dark came in and the stars found their places one by one, and the house behind them was warm and lit and full of the sounds of 3 children winding down toward sleep, And the ranch was quiet around them in the way of things that are alive and working and resting. Clara Whitmore had come to this place with nothing she had chosen. She was staying with everything she had built. And the distance between those two facts was the whole of the story. Not a story about rescue, not a story about a transaction redeemed, but a story about a person who had been handed a terrible beginning and had made, from it, with her own hands and her own stubbornness and her own daily choosing, something real, something that held, something that had her name on it. She sat beside her husband in the Wyoming evening and listened to her family settle into sleep and let herself be, without condition, exactly where she was. It was enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed the winter to show her that it was.